joined by Dr. Abigail Norris Turner and Dr. Susan Koletar. Dr. Norris Turner is the infectious disease epidemiologist in the Department of Internal Medicine at The Ohio State University. For nearly 20 years, Dr. Norris Turner's research has focused on characterizing the behavioral, clinical, and immunological factors associated with the acquisition of HIV and other sexually transmitted infections. She has a secondary research interest in examining methodological approaches to better measure sensitive or stigmatized health exposures and outcomes. Since the spring, Dr. Norris Turner has focused on understanding the epidemiology of COVID-19 in Ohio, and tonight she will speak about how vaccine trials work, safety endpoints, distribution challenges, and survey data about vaccine hesitancy. Our other guest this evening is Dr. Susan Koletar. Dr. Koletar is the director of the Division of Infectious Diseases at the Ohio State Wexner Medical Center. Dr. Koletar's clinical interests are infections in immunological hosts, especially HIV-infected and transplant recipients. Dr. Koletar is the principal investigator of the Wexner Medical Center's COVID-19 vaccine trial and will cover the various COVID-19 vaccines and immunology more broadly this evening. Thank you so much, Dr. Norris Turner and Dr. Koletar, for being here with us this evening, and I will turn it over to both of you. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me here tonight. And it's really nice to be back at the Bexley Public Library. The first public talk that I gave about COVID-19 was actually here at BPL, and it was on March 9th, 2020, which happened to be the day that the first 3 COVID cases were detected or were reported in the state of Ohio. So obviously we've come a really long way since then. So I'm really excited to be here and share what we know, the good news about vaccines. So some important disclaimers as I get started. So I'm not representing my employer, Ohio State, nor any of the other policy or public health groups with which I collaborate and partner on this pandemic work. Another important disclaimer is that things are changing every day. So COVID is continued to surprise everyone who touches it on the research side, on the clinical side, and in many other arenas. And so I'm sharing with you today the best information that we have at this time. But the difference between what I told you in March and what I can report today is pretty substantial. And so I'm sure things will continue to change as we get more information going forward. So I'm going to start with a COVID-19 snapshot. As of this morning, we had surpassed 68 million COVID cases documented worldwide, and that's more than 1.5 million deaths. And again, not to talk too much about March, but to compare back to that time, and in early March, there had been only 114,000 COVID cases detected worldwide. And actually the United States ranked 8th on the list of affected areas. And we were 8th after the Diamond Princess cruise ship, which at that time had 696 cases to the United States 624. So obviously things have really shifted quite a lot since then. Looking now at cases in the United States, as of this morning, we've surpassed 15 million documented cases, and we're approaching 290,000 deaths. And both of these numbers are substantial increases from just 2 weeks ago, Thanksgiving week. So the surge that we've entered at the beginning of November is not just still with us, but it's continuing to accelerate. So if we look at the deaths also in the United States, you can see that the number of new deaths each day now in December rivals what we were seeing back in the early and most scary time of COVID, which was that peak in April and early May. And here we are in Ohio, just to remind you what it is close to home. So we've now passed more than 500,000 cases here in our state and more than 7,000 deaths. You can see that the epidemic curve in Ohio has a little bit of a different shape than the one that is in the country broadly, where we didn't see quite as much in the April and May time. And we also didn't see quite as much in the July and August time that was seen nationwide, but we are just as much surging as everywhere else now that we're in this November, December timeframe. And similarly, if you look by counties across Ohio, you can see that there's really high incidence in every county in Ohio with just a couple of exceptions. And that's Franklin County there right in the middle with the yellow star. So I've just shared with you a bunch of bad news, just to remind us all the context that we're facing as we head into the winter here in the United States. But I'm reminding you of that context because the other really exciting thing that has happened in the last couple of weeks is that we have really, really very good news to share. And that is about the new vaccine trials that are just wrapping up now and the high efficacy that is being documented in those trials. So my goal over the next few minutes is to inform and educate about some of the terms that you're going to hear in reference to those trials, and some of the information that you might question and you might shake your head at and not understand. I'm going to try to interpret what some of that means so that you can have a better understanding of it going forward. So I'm going to start with just a quick reminder about what a randomized controlled trial is. And actually before COVID, I was an epidemiologist of RCTs. And so this is a real sweet spot for me as an epidemiologist and kind of understanding how these designs work. So all randomized controlled trials, and this is the gold standard for demonstrating the efficacy of a new product, all of them compare the effects of an active product, in this case, the vaccine, against a control product. So in this case, a placebo. And at the beginning of the study, all the participants in the study are unvaccinated. No one's been exposed to any vaccine at the beginning of the study. And also all of them are COVID-19 negative, because what we're evaluating is the risk of COVID-19 among the people who go on to get the vaccine. Another really important consideration is that who gets the vaccine and who gets the placebo is decided by chance. That's the randomized component of this trial design. It's not decided by the investigators who pick people. It's not decided by the participants themselves. It's decided by something that's the equivalent of a fair coin flip. And most of the COVID vaccine trials, although not all of them, allocate people equally, half to get the vaccine and half to get the placebo. It doesn't alternate vaccine then placebo, vaccine then placebo. It's a random algorithm that really is just like a coin flip. Also importantly in these trials is that information about who gets the vaccine and who gets the placebo is blinded. So the investigators don't know which participants get which product, and neither do the participants. And the reason for that is that we want people to act as though they don't know. We don't want them to make different decisions based on whether they think they've been vaccinated or not. They might choose to expose themselves in more risky ways if they think they got the vaccine. And so we keep that a secret from everyone. And similarly, clinicians might treat people differently if they thought somebody had had a vaccine. So that information is all kept masked from anybody who has to do with the study until the end. And then we enroll enough people in these trials that we can compare them at the end of the study. So we make sure that we have a big enough group that the group of people who get the vaccine is the same as the group of people who get the placebo. They're the same in terms of their age distribution, their race and ethnicity distribution, their underlying disease status in terms of how whether they have comorbid conditions that place them at increased risk. They're just the same. And the point of that is so that at the end, when we count up the COVID cases in the people who got the vaccine and the people who got the placebo, we can attribute the difference in COVID cases to the vaccine. If the two groups were different, if one group seemed sicker than the other one, then we might be likely to say, well, maybe it wasn't the vaccine that put people at higher COVID risk. Maybe it was something else. But by enrolling enough people to have balance in those two groups, we can attribute the change in COVID cases between them to the vaccine. So there's a number of phases of randomized controlled trials that are needed before the FDA will approve. And it starts way back, actually, even in a preclinical stage before people get involved at the bench in cell studies and animal studies. Phase 1 studies, which are also randomized and also involve active product and placebo. That involves a really small number of people, just 10 or maybe 20 people. And the focus is totally on safety to look for adverse events and to figure out the dose. Phase 2 is a slightly bigger group, up to 200 people. And that, again, is an intensive focus on safety. Is this product that we're giving to people, this early group, are we seeing adverse events in that group? Are we seeing bad outcomes? Phase 2 is also where we begin to have a little peek at whether there's a signal of it being effective. Is there a difference at the end of the phase 2 trial between the people who get the vaccine and the people who get the placebo. Phase 3 are the really big studies. They have tens of thousands of people in them. The Pfizer trial that I'll talk about in a minute had more than 43,000 people enrolled. And this is the big study that happens before FDA approval, where the primary focus is, there are two of them. One is on the efficacy, does it work to prevent COVID infection? And the second is on safety. So again, you might see adverse events in 45,000 people that you didn't get to see in 200. So there's a very close assessment of those safety endpoints there. It's also a big enough group that you can look at other questions that are harder to see in a smaller study. So you can look at the effect of the vaccine in different subgroups or on different ways to define the outcome, for example, symptomatic or asymptomatic disease. And you can also look at the strength and duration of immunity. You can measure antibody titers, and you can look at how long after somebody gets the vaccine did they have a risk of COVID. And then the final phase, which we hear a little bit less about generally, is phase 4. And this will be very important with COVID vaccination because generally this is a continued safety assessment. So if hundreds of millions of people go on to get these vaccines, there will probably be an emergence of extremely rare side effects that don't become evident in the smaller studies of just 45,000 people. But this is a very traditional part of vaccine studies or any kind of drug study, this phase 4, where you do safety tracking afterwards. And always, for all of these studies, the data are examined by an external data and safety monitoring board. And that board has access both to the blinded data, but also to the unblinded data. And they take a look at a set of pre-specified time points to look at the effectiveness and also safety outcomes. And they have the power both to stop the study or to approve it to continue. Okay. So I'm going to talk for a little minute about vaccine efficacy. And the reason why is because I know as newspapers started publishing findings that for example, the Pfizer vaccine or the Moderna vaccine is 95% effective, that sounds to some people that 95% of people who get this vaccine won't get COVID, right? Everybody can agree that 95% sounds really good, but in fact, vaccine efficacy is defined as the percentage reduction of disease in a vaccinated group compared to an unvaccinated group. And this is how we calculate it. So I want to be very clear that the figure I'm about to show you was created by me to be an illustrative example. I'm going to use numbers that came from the Pfizer study, but the actual figure I created, and this actual figure is not published anywhere. It was just created by me. So full disclosure about that. I want to orient you to what you're looking at. So on the y-axis, you have percent infected, and this goes from 0 at the bottom up to 1% at the top. So we're talking about low proportions of people who are becoming infected. On the x-axis, we have time. So that stretches out. And, depending on the trial, time could be measured in days or weeks or months. Most of the COVID vaccines are measured in weeks. And this is what happens. Sorry, and at the 0 time point, we'll have 0% of people who are infected, right? Because remember, I told you that at the start of the study, no one has COVID. So in the Pfizer trial, there were 43,500 people who were randomized, half to the placebo arm and half to the vaccine arm. They got their jab, and then the investigators started to follow them forward in time. And if you look at what happened in the placebo arm, as time progressed, a few more, and then a few more, and then a few more people got COVID, as you'd expect. This is the placebo arm. They don't actually have any protection from this infection because of this intervention. Over the course of the study, 162 people out of that nearly 22,000 people in that group, 162 people got COVID. And that translates to about 0.7%. So less than 1% of people in the placebo arm in the Pfizer trial went on to get COVID. In contrast, if you look at the vaccine arm, well, only 8 of those people in the vaccine arm went on to get COVID, 8 out of nearly 22,000. And that translates to that much smaller number, 0.037. So whereas in the placebo arm, less than 1% got COVID, in the vaccine arm, less than 0.1% got COVID. So that's a pretty big difference. But how do we get to 95%? So again, here are the numbers I just showed you on the previous slide. The way that you calculate vaccine efficacy is to divide the risk in the vaccine arm by the risk in the placebo arm. And if we divide those numbers here, we get 0.05 or 5%. The interpretation is that the risk of COVID in the vaccine arm was 5% of the risk of COVID in the placebo arm. And thus the vaccine is considered 95% effective. After I made that illustrative figure, sort of pulling from here and there and using a lot of kind of Photoshop, the FDA published their report just yesterday where they analyzed the data from Pfizer, and they produced a figure that looks a bit, although not exactly like the one that I produced, but the pattern is the same. The red line is the people in the placebo arm. You can watch that going up as more people got infected. The blue arm is the people in the vaccine arm, and you can see that staying very low because those people turned out to have quite a lot of protection. And actually, really very interestingly, from this figure, we can see that the benefit of the vaccine began to be evident after just 14 days. So as early as 14 days after inoculation, these curves begin to separate and show the effectiveness of the vaccine. Also importantly, as reported by the FDA, there was not a difference in efficacy in this product by age, by race or ethnicity, and also by underlying health conditions. So this is all excellent, excellent news for people who will go on to be vaccinated. I'm going to switch gears now a little bit and talk about vaccine hesitancy. So this is not a new concept. In fact, the World Health Organization identified vaccine hesitancy as one of the top 10 threats to global health back a year ago in 2019. They were a little bit kind of ahead of their time. Here it is, number 8. I will note that they also selected another important pandemic on their list, although they got it a little bit wrong. But obviously, this is the threat to global health that we've spent most of our time on this year. So vaccine hesitancy is the reluctance or refusal to get a vaccination despite its existence. So despite the availability of the product. And the research suggests that there are really 3 drivers of vaccine hesitancy. So one is complacency. If you aren't particularly worried about the disease that the vaccine prevents, you might not be that motivated or feel that interested in getting it. The second one is if it's inconvenient or hard to get to the vaccine. So it might exist, but it might be a challenge for you to get to that place. Like the clinic might be far away, or there might be a cost to it that isn't important enough to you to get the vaccine. And then the last one, which is what we're talking a lot about with COVID, is a lack of confidence in the efficacy or the safety of the vaccine, or a combination of those things. So I look a lot at the scientific literature, but in fact, for thinking about vaccine hesitancy, it's much better to look at population level surveys, for example, from Gallup, which is what this is, because a research study asks research participants questions, and they're not really representative of the general population. So Gallup has been tracking this over the last several months with the question, if an FDA-approved vaccine to prevent coronavirus was available right now at no cost, would you agree to be vaccinated? And you can see that the number went from a high of about 66% who said yes, down to a low of 50% in mid-September, and then it's rebounded a bit. And in the most recent data from Gallup, about 6 in 10 American adults say that they would be vaccinated if they were offered the vaccine. There's a hope that now that, these data were last collected before we had this news about a highly effective vaccine. So there's a hope that this number will continue to increase, since now it's not such a theoretical question. We actually have these products and people will be able to get them relatively soon. So what's associated with vaccine hesitancy? Well, the first and most important thing that is associated with refusing to get a vaccine is mistrust of medical research. And this has a long and very difficult history in this country and elsewhere, and stems from really mistreatment of certain populations in research. So putting people unconsented into research studies, or really medical racism that has to do with mistreatment, particularly of racial and ethnic minorities in research. And so individuals from those groups tend to have lower acceptance of vaccines because they fear continued mistreatment in that system. And there needs to be a lot of work throughout the medical system, throughout the public health system, in community engagement, in speaking with communities about what went into developing this vaccine, and the belief that it is safe, and really hearing what people have to say about their fears about it. People also may not trust the benefit of the vaccine. So if they fear that there are side effects or risks associated with getting it, those fears might be greater than the benefit that they expect to get from the vaccine, and that trade-off might not be perceived as good enough for them. They might worry about future effects that haven't yet been detected. And again, we're hearing more about that because this vaccine was developed quickly that maybe those future effects haven't been seen yet. And then we also see concerns from people about commercial profiteering, for example, from pharmaceutical companies. And again, newly emerging with COVID, there are some people who fear that the FDA is maybe rushing to approve something through this emergency use authorization process, and they want it to go through a really the full FDA review instead of the emergency use authorization. So what's associated with vaccine acceptance? Well, these are just the flip side of the same coin. So people who believe that the vaccine is highly effective, overall, and also in preventing very serious disease are more likely to want it. If you ask hypothetically, would you get a vaccine that protects you for 1 year versus 5 years? People are more willing to get a 5-year vaccine because they perceive any risks would be balanced out by that increased benefit. I don't mean to suggest that any COVID vaccines will last for 5 years, but in these hypothetical experiments, that's associated with increased acceptability. And people also want to know that it's been endorsed by public health authorities like the CDC and the World Health Organization. And last, in the United States in particular, if the vaccine was developed outside the United States, people are less trusting of it. So part of why I'm spending some time talking about a vaccine hesitancy is because it relates to another important epidemiological concept, and that is herd immunity. So you've heard of herd immunity. It's this concept that a population of people can be protected if a certain threshold of immunity is reached. And this will occur when enough people become immune that this ongoing spread of disease is unlikely. It's not that the disease vanishes, it's that it isn't likely to find a susceptible population of people in whom to continue to spread. And that leads to protection of the entire community, even people who aren't themselves immune. And herd immunity can be achieved through both vaccination or natural infection. So here's a figure showing the same concept. The pink figures represent a person who's infected. The blue figures represent a person who's susceptible, and the green figures represent a person who's immune to disease. And in the top panel, you can see that when no one has immunity, that red or that pink figure can infect all the blue figures, almost all the blue figures, because no one has any protection from disease. In the middle panel, some people are immune. We could say it's because they were vaccinated or they had had the infection previously. And those people, that green circle kind of protects some of the blue susceptible people from being infected. So some of them still get sick. Some of them are still, they are still susceptible, and some of them will go on to get disease, but many fewer of them in that scenario. And in the bottom panel, you can see what happens when a high enough proportion of people are immune, again, through vaccination in this example, that although an infection is introduced into the community, it can't spread because it doesn't ever reach those susceptible people. So vaccine hesitancy and herd immunity are related in the following way. If we want to achieve herd immunity in our communities, in the population, we need to get into that blue triangle at the top of this figure. And we can get there through a couple of different pathways. So on the y-axis, we have vaccine efficacy, which can go from 0 to 100%. So this is how good is the vaccine, with a higher number being better. On the x-axis, we have vaccine coverage. So this is how many people, what percentage of people will go on to get the vaccine. And we can get into that blue triangle at the top if we have a pretty good vaccine, like a B minus kind of vaccine, 60-ish% effective, but we give it to 100% of people. That's going to get us into that herd immunity space. If we have a somewhat better vaccine, like an 80% effective vaccine, well, then we don't have to vaccinate 100% of people. Then we can vaccinate 75% of people, and we'll get into that blue triangle. If we have a really excellent effective vaccine, which seems to be where we are right now with the two candidates that have released more of the data, a 95% effective vaccine, well, that drops our vaccine coverage requirement down to around 70%. That's what we would need to achieve herd immunity. And the other thing I should say here is that if there's a lot of people in the community who have had disease and have at least some residual immunity from that, although we don't really understand how COVID immunity works after natural infection, that would make that blue triangle kind of bigger. Then all of these numbers could be a little bit lower and we would still achieve herd immunity. So the last thing I want to touch on is the challenges to vaccine distribution, since we're really on the cusp of this huge logistical effort that we'll undertake across the country. I've already talked about vaccine hesitancy. There are issues related to the cold chain. So some of these vaccines have to be stored at exceptionally low temperatures, which makes it a challenge for distributing in low resource settings. Anything that we achieve for the first dose of the vaccine, we have to then turn around and do again 28 days later, because these products are developed to be taken first as one dose and then 28 days later, the booster. Importantly, there are some populations which have been excluded from the testing up till now, and that includes pregnant and lactating women, and also children under 12 years of age, which, of course, is a interesting thing to consider, given that the trials in children won't start until there's documented, proven, effective products for adults, and that is really pushing up against the 2021 academic school year, is whether kids could be vaccinated before that school year started. And then last, we have challenges related to the quantity of vaccine. So the Centers for Disease Control Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, ACIP, has released some guidelines related to who they think the priority populations will be. The state of Ohio has endorsed those guidelines, but how they actually get rolled out and the timeline on which they get rolled out isn't clear yet. I do know that the first doses of vaccine are due to arrive in Ohio in the middle of this month, December 15th, and that's about 100,000 doses. And then on the 22nd, another 200,000 doses will be delivered. So we really are just days to weeks from starting this rollout here, just right in our own community. That is assuming that the FDA approves the products. This is a nice tool from the New York Times, which lets you enter just a very little basic information, your age, your state, and lets you figure out where you'll be in the priority list for getting your vaccine. So some key points just to wrap up. You know, there's a lot of bad news about COVID. We have surging cases, also surging deaths. We have some real problems around how we're going to roll out this vaccine in terms of vaccine hesitancy and this ability to achieve herd immunity. And also, we can't mislead people to say that as soon as the vaccine's here, this whole pandemic's going to turn on a dime. It isn't. It's going to take months for large benefits to be visible. But it is going to work after some months. And the really good news that we just can't overstate is that vaccines appear to be extremely effective, safe, and they will be here very, very soon. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Susan Koletar.
Thank you, Abby. I always learn things when you talk, so it was great listening to that presentation. And thank you, Leanne, for the invitation, and thanks for everyone who's listening on this evening program. So I'm gonna sort of do a general overview about COVID, and then hopefully leave some time for questions. And I'm gonna assume that I'm gonna not say anything that's not known, but we'll just go from there. First thing I want to say that I seem to start all my talks now is that it literally has been less than a year since COVID-19 has been recognized as a worldwide problem. It was the end of December in Wuhan, China, where the cases were first recognized. So we're a couple weeks away from being at a year. That being said, it seems like a lifetime. Right. I mean, we've been dealing with this for it just seems like forever, and everyone is tired. And so I think Abby's point about there's light at the end of the tunnel is what should motivate us now. The tunnel is not quite as short as we want, but it's clearly in sight. So again, I think everyone knows this by now because it's been in the news constantly, but the SARS-CoV-2 is the name of the coronavirus that was discovered at the end of December last year. And the disease that it causes is called COVID-19. And I want to just step back for a second and say I've been doing infectious diseases for a long time, and I started my career in the HIV at the beginning of the HIV epidemic. And just to put things in perspective about the amazing speed of science now, when HIV was first recognized as a syndrome and as a problem, it took 2 years to identify the virus. This took 2 weeks. It took another 2 years to develop a blood test. Blood tests were being developed as the virus was being sequenced along the way. So everything has been very rapid and somewhat dizzying in terms of speed when you think about where we started and where we are. And I say that because I think some of that speed has made people anxious, particularly about vaccines and are they safe. So there's a lot of coronaviruses in the world, actually. This one, through some mutations, caused problems that no one was immune to. So that's why it spread so rapidly. And I don't think anybody wants to get into all the nitty gritty science, but it's basically a respiratory tract infection, and it affects both, the upper airways and the lower airways. And some people get sick and get infected, don't have any symptoms. Some people have sort of cold, flu-like symptoms, feel pretty badly for a short period of time, but they get better. Other people, and some of those people we recognize are people who have other significant health conditions, heart disease or kidney disease or lung diseases, or have been immunocompromised for all kinds of other different reasons, or are older, or belong to populations that may be a little bit more socially disadvantaged and not have as much access to health care. Those people can end up in the hospital, and sadly some of those die. So having a respiratory tract infection makes it possible to transmit it to others. And that makes sense when people actually have symptoms and they're coughing. But some people, even who don't have any symptoms, can transmit it. And that's some of our continued struggles. And since it is a respiratory virus, it's transmitted through what we consider droplets, so infected sort of little droplets of secretions that can go through the air. They can go sometimes far. If they dry out, they can go a little farther, but most droplets will fall to the ground or fall to surfaces within 3 to 6 feet. And so when we think about how we use this, how we use other things to decrease transmission, it's sort of based on this transmission route. I did say that they can fall and remain on surfaces for some period of time. And so obviously the advice to not touch your face, not touch your eyes, is related to that. You can potentially inadvertently infect yourself. I gotta say though, that over the past year, this transmission mode is pretty uncommon. Not that you shouldn't be cleaning off surfaces and stuff, but it's really not the main thing. It's purely a respiratory pathogen. And because of that, you think most of this, the primary symptoms, particularly early on, were respiratory tract symptoms, fevers, usually higher than 100 Fahrenheit, cough, problems breathing. It's the respiratory tract problems that bring people to the hospital. They tend to, breathing's a good thing. If you're feeling more short of breath and you need some help breathing, that's usually why people come to the hospital. Other things that people have talked about, loss of taste, loss of smell, that's an interesting phenomenon. I think we're trying to figure that out. Some other just basic, muscle aches, some nausea. Sometimes some people have some GI symptoms, but the things that really lead to more severe disease requiring hospitalization are respiratory tract symptoms. Oops, wrong way. And knowing that, then we can address it, right? So if you're having some of those symptoms, particularly the fevers and the cough and or aches and whatever, really call your doctor and stay home. We live in a society where people like to be out and go to work, or some people feel like they have to go to work. But really, if you can avoid that, just please stay home. Obviously, excellent hygiene. Coughing or sneezing into your elbow, washing your hands, cleaning objects, all important. I think one of the things that pandemic has taught us is that we are a social people and like to gather, and it's been one of the more distressing things, particularly as we come upon holiday seasons. It's really it really has put a damper on things, but again, there's light at the end of the tunnel. And then the 6 feet apart really comes from transmission, and you'll find papers that will say, yes, you can transmit the virus further. Sometimes people could find it, 27 feet away, but for the most part, it's relatively closer contact, and 6 feet seems to be a decent number in terms of distance. And then the idea of interrupting spread with a barrier, wearing either a cloth face mask or something to covering your mouth and your nose. And that's it. Those are the two areas that actually virus can be expelled from, the nose and the mouth. So wearing a mask around your chin is not helpful. I periodically watch some of the college football games this year and always cringe when I see coaches on the sidelines with their masks half down, especially when they pull them down to yell. That's always disturbing to me. But having that barrier protects not only spreading the virus to someone else, but it also protects you too. And having two barriers makes that better. So it's sort of simple physics in some sense. So again, in the interest of time, I won't go into the things that we have done in terms of improving treatments. I think there are some treatment modalities that are really helping, but what everyone's most interested in, and what Abby gave such a nice summary of, is about SARS-CoV-2 vaccines. And this is actually sort of a benefit of vaccines across the board. You benefit the individual, ideally by preventing infection, but also by reducing the severity of illness. And that's important. And we have lots of evidence that vaccines, particularly for respiratory infections, work that way. Flu shots, for instance, and I'll just make a little plug here. If you haven't gotten your flu shot this year, please do. It's time. Even if people have a flu shot and they've gotten exposed and infected with influenza, the severity of illness tends to be much less and can keep people out of the hospital. And then obviously the idea of reducing transmission throughout the community is a huge benefit of vaccines across the board. So this is the picture of the little rascal that's causing all these problems here, the coronavirus. That's a oops, gosh, I'm sorry, I'm having a little moment here. So one of the hallmark findings of the coronavirus is the spike protein, and that's an artist depiction. This is more of a cartoonish depiction, but the spike protein is an important part of the virus because that protein is what attaches to the healthy cells. And again, sort of a little cartoon looking at this. There's the SARS-CoV-2 with the spikes. There's a healthy cell. They have cells have all kinds of receptors on them. These receptors in particular are called ACE2 receptors. The virus attaches, gets into the cell, and causes disease. The idea of a vaccine that attacks that spike protein is from the development of antibodies. So if you can give the spike protein and you have a healthy immune system, your immune system creates the antibodies to fight the virus. And then when an infection occurs, these antibodies attach to the virus and allows it not to attack the cell. So sort of a pretty picture here. So the coronavirus here in purple, it's spike protein. This is a human cell, probably a respiratory cell. Here's an ACE receptor. And so if this is the target. And if you do nothing, the spike attaches to the receptor and then through several other processes gets into the cell and causes disease. If you have antibodies, sort of in the purple and greenish here, it attaches to the spike in a couple of different places, and then the spike can't attach to the receptor, and if it can't attach to the receptor, it can't get into the cell and it can't cause disease. And so that's how it works. And all the vaccines now, both the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine, and the others that are coming, are all addressing the spike protein. And I just want to take just a minute to talk about the vaccine development process. Abby talked about this, about the phases of clinical trials. And we usually think of phases of clinical trials as a process of years as opposed to months. And the first phases, there's the preclinical phases. That's probably not 3 months, that's probably more like 6 months. The first phase ones, those safety phases where you have relatively small numbers of people, usually take somewhere less than a year. Phase 2 take a little bit longer. Phase 3 sometimes takes 3, 4, 5 years, depending on what the disease you're looking at. And then there's the manufacturing processes and then finally the distribution. So that timeline across the board can be pretty prolonged. The timeline for vaccine development for SARS-CoV-2 has been dramatically compressed. Remember, I said it's really been less than a year since we've been dealing with SARS-CoV-2. And so to get from that point of recognition of a new pathogen to having a vaccine is just phenomenal and speaks to the beauty of science, quite honestly. But let me talk through that just a little bit. This didn't just happen overnight. So some of the vaccine technology that's being looked at, both the mRNA technology, the vector virus technology, and other just recombinant protein technology have all been in some stages of development over the years. I'll talk about sort of more classic things, but the mRNA technology really has been under investigation now for probably about 10 years, looking at trials for other interesting viruses like Ebola and Zika, and actually even influenza. So that process was started when the genome of SARS-CoV-2 was identified so quickly. It was easy to incorporate that into the vaccine process. That was one thing. Second thing is that the phases were compressed. So they started as preliminary data was coming in phase 1, and the safety signal seemed to be reasonable. They were able to increase the sample size and look for more efficacy. And then as that got a little closer, they were able to increase to the large samples that we've talked about. And, the Pfizer trial was 40,000 some people. The Moderna trial was 30,000 some people. And so doing those large trials in a state where there is so much disease in the world, we were able to get the answers quicker. And then the other important thing about this, and this is part of the whole Operation Warp Speed, I'll talk about that in a second, is that the drug companies, the vaccine manufacturers, started manufacturing with the early signals. When they started realizing that there was going to be some efficacy, they started manufacturing. So in a time that typically manufacturing wouldn't start until the trials were completely finished and made sure everything was in place, it happened sort of in a parallel universe. And that's how we got so quickly. And some of this in the United States happened under the sort of the federal public-private corporation institute called the Operation Warp Speed. And I got to tell you, I've never liked that. Not that I have anything against Star Trek. I think it was Star Trek. But the warp speed sometimes sounds like it's been distorted enough and fast enough that safety has been sacrificed. And I've been watching the trials since the beginning, and I feel very strongly that that's not true. But I just wanted to put it into some context of how the trials got so compressed. I'm talking way too much here. Let me keep moving on. So let me talk about vaccine designs for a second. This is sort of a generic slide about vaccine designs in general. Sort of classic vaccines, childhood vaccines are live attenuated viruses. So measles, mumps, rubella. They tend to be very long lasting and really mimic natural immunity. And so one of the questions is natural immunity better? It's better if you actually truly get immunity and it's prolonged. Sometimes vaccine immunity is a little better, and sometimes the combination is best for herd immunity. So there's actually some studies going on in other parts of the world with some live attenuated SARS-CoV-2, but not that. Inactivated vaccines, same concept, except the pathogen or the virus is inactivated, so it actually can't cause disease. Live attenuated potentially could cause disease, inactivated can't. Then as we've gotten more and more sophisticated over time, there's some recombinant particles that really target the specific area that's causing the problem. So in this case, again, the spike protein. There's a couple of trials that are looking at this. Monoclonal antibodies is a different treatment opportunity, and if anyone wants to know, you can ask me later. But the two vaccines that are most in the news at the moment are mRNA vaccines, and that's messenger RNA, and it's basically takes the signals for the genome to code for the spike protein again. So one of the reasons these vaccines require such cold storage, as Abby referred to, is because messenger RNA is very unstable, and so you have to enclose it in fats and other things that are somewhat proprietary, and then they need to be frozen before they can to maintain any stability. That's also a downside of some of these vaccines, because once you thaw them, they have a relatively short half-life, and so the distribution is quite the process. And then there's some vector vaccines where they take other viruses. In the case of the SARS-CoV-2, they're adenoviruses, again, things that cause respiratory infections, and manipulated so they don't cause respiratory infections, but they can encode for the spike protein. So it's all about the spike. And again, I'm saying this more as a timeline, so you can see these are a couple early studies, but Moderna and Pfizer was not part of Operation Warp Speed, so that's not on here. But both of those trials started in mid to late July, and so here we are, mid to late December, and we already have vaccines that have shown some effectiveness. It's a little plug here. We are actually actively enrolling in the AstraZeneca trial. It's the virus vector trial. Again, preliminary results look pretty good, and then there are a few others that are ongoing. And so you might say, why do we need so many vaccine trials? Well, first of all, there's a lot of people who will need the vaccine, and second of all, they have a couple different nuances among the different groups, and some of it just being storage and need for freezing or refrigeration, and some of it is as more and more data come out, may be better in some groups than others. So we don't know that yet. Let me make a few comments about risks of vaccines, because that's what people really worry about. So all vaccines have some common risks. Most vaccines are a shot in the arm, and it hurts a little bit. Some pain, sometimes some redness, some swelling. That happens with most immunizations. Some people have more what we call systemic symptoms, where they get fevers or low-grade fevers, some chills, some rashes, aches and pains. Usually relatively short-lived, a day or two, and then just go better. It sounds sort of weird, but that's actually sort of a good sign, because it means your body is reacting to something foreign and truly trying to fight it. And so I think that it seems to help with antibody responses. And there are rare occasions of severe allergic reactions, such as hives or swelling lips or difficulty breathing. I think there was just recently a report of that with the Pfizer vaccine. Usually really pretty rare, and that happens. That's just one of the risks we all appreciate as something that can happen, although it's pretty uncommon. Most of the vaccines to date in studies are 2 doses, and it's interesting that some of the reactions are related to timing. The mRNA vaccines seem to have more significant findings after the second dose. And when I say more significant, probably about, I think it was 17%, it was less than 20% of the people had some fever, myalgias or something, didn't feel that great. So not everyone, but most of them are relatively mild. Most of them got better within 1 to 2 days. The viral vector vaccines tend to have more symptoms after the first dose, which is interesting, and I think we need to learn more. And then there's more to come. So let me finish with this. I think, again, the speed has been dizzying, but exciting. I don't think there's been much compromise of safety, and the FDA, before this all started, put together some stipulations about safety in particular. Let me just make a comment. An emergency use authorization from the FDA is a legal standard that allows the FDA to release things sooner than their more comprehensive review that would happen after a trial is over. So Typically, the typical process, and again, the reason phase 3 trials take so long sometimes is because it takes so long for licensure is because all that data is collected before it goes to the FDA. In the EUA situation, the FDA is allowed to set parameters about what they find to be acceptable. And in this case, of these COVID vaccines, the design requirements were 50% efficacy in the early interim analysis, so they far surpassed that, and at least 3 months of safety data, 2 months being after the second dose for half of the people. So I'm not sure if I'm making anybody feel better or worse, but because the big numbers in the trials, that's a substantial amount of data. It's just not a lot over time. So I think the keys are, one, we're all anxiously awaiting the reviews and see what the stipulations will be. And two, to really continue to collect the data about what happens going forward in terms of duration of protection, in terms of long-term safety, and in terms of how these vaccines really make an impact on this pandemic. I think I'm going to stop because we don't have much time for questions, but I'm happy to take some. And so is Abby.
Thank you, Dr. Koletar and Dr. Norris Turner. Those were excellent presentations, and I learned a lot. Okay, so getting started right off the bat. Understanding that there is still a small chance that you can get COVID-19 even with the vaccine, does getting the vaccine lower the chances for harsh or deadly symptoms?
Yeah, let me take it. That is the claim to fame. Both Moderna and Pfizer, and actually some of the early preliminary results on AstraZeneca, that's where the biggest bang for their buck is, decreasing the severity of symptoms. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, if you participated in a clinical trial, does that mean you cannot get the vaccine when it is being given to the general, being given to the general public?
That's a common question. Now, so first of all, let me say this and say it again. Participation in clinical trials is always voluntary. We don't force people to stay in the trials. And we do trials because we don't know an answer to a question. And so I'm not sure how to totally interpret this given to the general public. The first use of these vaccines are going to be under an emergency use authorization. It's going to be rolled out to designated groups of people that have been sort of vetted at all kinds of levels. When it's being given to when there's enough being given to the general public, it may be FDA actually approved by then. Mm-hmm. So, but I can also tell you that all the trials that are ongoing, because they're still ongoing, is trying to address this question, because the real question is it ethical to give someone a placebo if you know something works? And I can tell you that people are addressing that now. So does that mean you cannot? No, it does not mean that.
Thank you.
Maybe I can just add that it's a conventional part of clinical trials that if you participate in one and you were in the placebo arm, but the active arm was found to be effective, that the trial designers find a way to give you the active drug when the trial is over, or that give you access to the active vaccine. And so the timeline of those things, I think to Sue's point, the timeline of those things is uncertain right now because the trials are ongoing and they're trying to collect data through the end of the trial. But whether that person would go on to get the active vaccine, absolutely that person would be eligible to get the active vaccine. And I imagine the trials have different protocols set up for that very thing. So a person who was in the trial would absolutely be able to get the product when it became available.
Yeah. Thanks for saying that, Abby.
Thank you. So we had a couple questions concerning children. And so Abby, you brought up that children have not been in the trials yet. What is the time frame? Do we know when there will be a vaccine for children? And if kids can't get the vaccine yet, do we still need our children to distance, so social distance, and wear masks? How do we protect them?
So I think Sue may know more about this than I. So the first answer is that they'll do the pediatric trials. If they happen, they'll do them after the adult trials, have found an effective product, and with a lot of that same kind of phasing to make sure that it's safe for kids and working out the doses for kids and those kinds of things. There's a lot of focus on the idea that children are not mini adults. You can't just adjust the weight and give the same product, right? There's tons of literature, because most vaccines go to pediatric populations, right? There's tons of literature about how one would consider vaccines differently for kids. I'm a parent, in addition to being an epidemiologist, until actually my kids actually are over 12, so they would qualify for the adult vaccine. So the group that's not been tested are the under 12s. So I think it depends. What's the state of the COVID world at the time that kids go back into schools, right? If we've achieved herd immunity and the cases are much, much lower, maybe there's less of a risk to kids in that environment, or less of a risk to the adults in their lives if the kids do become infected. But maybe that's not the case. Like, we really don't know what the world is going to look like by the summer or by the start of next fall. I know that there's a lot of pediatric folks very focused on kids vaccines and really got that kind of ticking time toward, August, September of 2021 in mind. So a lot of people are thinking about this. I just don't have the answer.
And the trials are in the final planning stages for a couple of the companies. It's clearly a big issue. But let me address the last one as a more broad statement. Getting the vaccine, whether it's in the next 2 weeks or in the next couple months, does not mean that we can take our masks off. We do not know the durability of response to this vaccine, and we still have to be careful. One of I think the first question was, does it protect you from severe disease? It does. What we don't honestly know is how much it prevents you from getting asymptomatic disease. So if you get a vaccine and you still get infected, but you don't have any symptoms, can you still spread disease? Maybe. And that's what, so please, anybody who gets a vaccine, please don't throw your masks away. Yeah, we're not there.
And that actually is a question that someone asked, and I don't know if we want to go ahead and skip to that question if you can, Jeff, but I believe that the question was, when vaccines start going out, do the people who get the vaccine, are we able to just go back to life as normal? So throw the mask away, we don't need to social distance anymore. Is that the case? And you're saying no,
I'm saying absolutely not right now.
Okay, good. That's what we want. We want clear answers. We want direction.
I think we still need to be vigilant.
Okay. Oh, so the question was specifically, once the high risk people are get vaccinated early. So no, everybody. The answer is no. We cannot go back.
I'm sticking with no.
Okay. Sorry, I made you go through all the slides. Okay. So you brought up herd immunity a little bit. I think that's really been the big buzzword around vaccines. So we had a couple questions. Does herd immunity work for COVID if you can get it multiple times? And is herd immunity better than a vaccine?
Yeah, so I can jump in a little bit. I'm going to change the question a little bit. I think the question is asking, is natural infection, does that give you better immunity than a vaccine? I think that's what this is getting at. And the answer to that question is that we don't know. There's so much we don't know about the duration of immunity following an infection with COVID, and how people become susceptible again, and on what time frame and severity of disease, and a whole lot of things. So I'll just say we don't know the answer to that question. But as it relates to herd immunity, herd immunity can be achieved by increasing immunity in the population, whether through vaccination or through natural disease, so natural infection. So herd immunity, goes up when people have immunity, however you get that immunity.
Okay.
Just to say one last thing. I think this idea about multiple infections with COVID is one of the really most interesting, scientifically interesting, clinically interesting, and complicated parts of this disease. Who seems to get it again? Why do they get it again? all of these questions do relate to the generation of population level immunity, and we don't have all of those questions yet. The hope is that the vaccine is going to wipe out some of those questions, because the vaccine will provide a longer duration of immunity than whatever's going on with natural infection. But these, again, are questions, as Sue will say, these are questions that we don't have answers to yet.
Yeah, no, I was going to make that point. We don't even really understand the duration of protection of antibodies after you have COVID. Certainly, if you have more severe disease, you're more likely to develop detectable antibodies, but how long they last and what they do. So yeah, it's a great time to be in medicine.
That's a good outlook to have. And I think, yeah, go ahead to the next question, please. We're getting some more in the chat too, and I want to be sure to get to at least one of them. So how many COVID-19 vaccines will be available? Will citizens get to choose between them? And does it matter which vaccine I get, Pfizer, Moderna, AZ, et cetera?
So there are about 6 trials going on now. The 2 that are going to be are being reviewed this week and next week. The Pfizer, Moderna will come out first. It is unlikely that individuals will get to choose which one of them, if they're one of the priority groups. I mean, I guess they would have a choice if you were in the highest priority group, first responder or a healthcare worker, and you said, no, I don't want to get the Moderna one. You could give up your spot to someone else, but I don't think, I don't know. Does it matter? I think it's too soon to tell. I think they're all going to, because they target the spike protein, will work pretty similarly. And I think maybe the question about the clinical trial, I want to say is that what we don't know, or another thing we don't know, is what the impact of getting one vaccine and then a booster of a different vaccine. We don't know that. That's a matter of big discussion among the people in the trials. If there's someone eligible to get an emergency use authorization, how are we going to deal with that? And there's a couple of different ways that I think will be acceptable, but we'll have to see.
Okay.
That was long-winded. No, huh? Sorry.
Yeah. Nope. Just take the shot they give you. Okay. All right. So will I get an ID card showing I've been vaccinated? Like, how do you know? Are we going to go around with badges? What do we say? How do we know that we've been vaccinated?
Scarlet C. I don't know. Actually, I don't know the answer. Have you heard any of this, Abby? Have you? I haven't heard that anyone's going to do it.
Not aware that any plan like this is being developed. I think the closest we get to this is workplaces trying to decide if they'll mandate the vaccine or not, as a way to protect their employees, and then if it's a public-facing business, as a way to protect their customers. And I think a lot of conversations about that. Sue and I both work at Ohio State, which does mandate us to be vaccinated against the flu. And is this going to be like that? I don't know. I can't imagine that restaurants or amusement parks will kind of check people at the door.
Right. Okay. Who is paying for these vaccines? So I assume, and I don't know what the question asker meant, but when I read this, I took this to mean if the vaccine is free for me, the patient, who is paying for them, I guess would be the question. Are they free from the government, or is my insurance, how are they being paid for?
Well, the government has invested literally billions of dollars into these vaccines. I don't know if that's going to be a long-term thing. I mean, that investment in part goes back to what I was saying about the manufacturing processes. They sort of had a deal with the drug companies that they would pay for them to do this. So I don't know if that's going to be a sustainable thing.
Well, and actually, speaking of sustainability, I'll go ahead and ask this question from the chat. A. Shimmer, what is the likelihood COVID-19 will mutate significantly enough such that the vaccines currently developed would no longer be sufficiently effective? Put another way, could we be back in the thick of a COVID pandemic within a few years?
Yeah, I think we always worry about mutating things. The virus has mutated. There's probably at least 6 different strains. None of those mutations have seemed to be significant enough to impact vaccine efficacy, but it's something we worry about. But so far we're keeping our fingers crossed.
Is there, to build on that, is there like a time frame in which we need to hit that? I think, was it 75% of the population or 80% of the population to get vaccinated with this vaccine so that that is less of a concern?
Yeah, sooner the better. Abby, maybe you want to answer that more eloquently for me.
Yeah, certainly the higher the vaccine coverage is right now, the less circulating COVID there will be. And so, or the less circulating SARS-CoV-2 virus there will be. And the less that there is that is circulating, the less likely there is to be a meaningful mutation. But I think the other part of Sue's answer, which is really important to emphasize, is this is the most monitored, the most surveilled virus in the history of humanity. Like, we know when it makes any change in any way, right? So a mutating virus is, to my opinion, is not likely to lead us back into the same place that we've been, just because we will see this happening in real time and we will pivot and react to that. We now have this massive set of tools that we can deploy to kind of control a change. So I think we've learned such a huge amount in the process of the last 10 or 11 months that the next time through will be different in terms of our response. So it may mutate and people watch that, but I'm not as pessimistic that it will put us back where we are right now.
And so
the question suggested that, but.
Yeah, and so that's actually the next question, because you already addressed the please don't throw away your masks. Someone asked, will the scientific knowledge gained during the process of creating COVID-19 vaccines impact future vaccine production? Or you mentioned that this is the most surveilled virus in human history. So have there been anything that you're excited about in the that we should be looking forward to?
Yeah, well, I think that's the goal of science, right? To always impact the future or whatever else you're studying. So, I mean, I made the comment early on, I think some of the early virology and immunology work that was at the forefront of the HIV epidemic really created the tools for people to be able to deal with these viral sequences and different things with COVID. So I think, the whole mRNA technology is fascinating, and I think that'll be used in the future. So, yeah. Again, long answer, yes.
I agree with that, but I think also, just to put a slightly different spin on it, this has been such a hard last set of months for all of us, for the world. It's just been such a devastating time. And yet the amount of scientific collaboration, international collaboration, interdisciplinary collaboration, cross-cultural collaboration is so stunning. It really should give us optimism about the next global challenge that we face. I mean, what we learned around ways to interact with one another, given the challenges of this moment and the incredible scientific success of this moment, is something that we should all have so much hope about.
Wow. Well, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. I feel like that should be our next program. We'll invite you and you can just tell us all about the cross-cultural and the hope. Okay, is there a last, I think there are a few more actually, if we, oh, and actually, so I did want to pull this question from the chat before we get to this question. And then it's up to you all. But since this is from someone in the chat, since this went at warp speed, does the number of trials or participants in the trials change from a normal vaccine course?
I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I mean, I think that the large sample size and the pandemic itself allowed things to happen so much more quickly.
Okay. Okay, great. Well, thank you. That's a great question. Can doctors choose to vaccinate people from subgroups which didn't participate in the studies, such as pregnant women?
So I think that comes to the question of was when it's approved. So there will be stipulations around the emergency use authorizations that should be followed. Once they're actually approved, then there's a fair amount of free range to do things if you're, if you don't worry about the legal context. I think the question of pregnant women is is an important one. And I understand, again, so many trials that when they're in the early phases exclude pregnant women primarily for safety. There were literally only a handful of pregnant women in the trial, so no one is willing to make that observation yet. But I think more and more work will be done. And I say that because I remember a time when it was not thought to be good to give pregnant women flu shots, and that changed. So I mean, again, we're working on such a compressed time frame here. I think in the future it probably will not be a question, but I also will say that I don't know if I would feel comfortable saying, yeah, you should vaccinate pregnant women now. I'm just not really ready to take that risk.
That makes sense. Okay, do we have, okay, can we do a couple more? Is that okay with you, the speakers? Okay, great. Okay, let's trust the data and assume that vaccines work at the population level. How confident can I be that they work at the individual level? How confidently can I confidently visit my elderly parents if they and I have both been vaccinated?
Well, I think I'll just keep saying what I've been saying. We the data that's making the efficacy estimates are based on individual data. There probably are likely populations within those large data sets that may have better or worse effectiveness. The elderly is a group that we always worry about in terms of immune function decreases with age, so they may not get as much. I guess the answer to this is there's no guarantees, but I think we should have some confidence that they work at the individual level, because then if they don't do that, they won't work at the population level. You can't have
That makes sense.
You can't have one without the other. I mean, I guess you can technically as a single person, but
Yeah, I have a slightly different answer to this, which is that the calculation of vaccine efficacy is just saying in a group of people who got the vaccine compared to a group of people who didn't, what's the percent decline of the group compared to the group? So what you're seeing is a massive statistically significant benefit of getting the vaccine in those groups. But what's really going to mean that your elderly parents won't get sick is that COVID has dropped, like the prevalence, the circulating number of cases has gone way down. And for that to happen, we have to achieve herd immunity. We have to get to a place where people who might have increased susceptibility because they were unvaccinated or because they didn't mount a perfect immune response when they got the vaccine, we have to get to a case where, in fact, the people in the room are not likely to have COVID. So the vaccines are a huge part of that. But just because you got it doesn't guarantee that everybody that you interact with is then safe from you or you from them.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I don't want to be a Debbie Downer here at the end, but we do not know how long these vaccines will work.
That's the next question, I think.
We don't know.
Yeah, was no, wait, there it was somewhere. One of the questions was, how long do we know how long the vaccine will stay, I guess, effective in our bodies once we get it, and will we need boosters after that?
Don't know.
Okay. Fair enough. That's what we want. We just want, the truth. So that's great. Okay. And then has any other vaccine been developed in such a short amount of time? Is there concern about deaths or adverse? So you talked a little bit about the adverse side effects, and I left this question in here specifically concern about death, just to make sure the person got their question.
Yeah, I think we always are concerned about this. There have been some deaths, not many in the trials. I'm having a senior moment here. The one trial in Brazil, actually, the one death in Brazil was actually a COVID-related death, I believe. But I don't think there has been any directly attributable deaths to the vaccine itself, if that's the question. I've not seen any data to suggest that.
Okay.
And the other adverse side effects, a little bit different among the vaccines, but all the general ones that I listed are pretty similar for all of them.
And I think an important consideration here, and this is, kind of why we host events like this and talk a lot about vaccine safety, is the reason why the whole world moved to create a vaccine is because death from COVID is a meaningful risk, right? And especially in the priority population groups, in older adults and in highly exposed people, the mortality risk is non-trivial. It's something we should all note, right? And so a death in a vaccine trial would be a devastating outcome and an exceedingly rare one, like a fraction of a percent, exceedingly rare. That is not the death rate for COVID. And so considering that there's going to be risks with lots of different kinds of interventions, the risk associated with a COVID vaccine from the data that we have right now is so much lower than the documented risk of actually having this disease that it's an important thing to compare head to head.
Absolutely. Thank you for saying that. That's the point of the whole thing. Okay, I think that was all of the questions. Thank you both so much for being here and volunteering your time and your expertise. We appreciate it so much. So thank you so much, everybody. Have a good night.